For those watching and listening, Reimagine Public Safety Debate 2024. We're going to get into question number 3. This is a juicy one. Bear with me for the watchers and listeners. I'm going to get into it. So question 3, Portland, along with other cities across the nation, is experiencing a rise in houselessness driven by the lack of affordable housing. Ongoing COVID pandemic has economically wrecked entire communities, devastated households, and a significant and continued lack of access to mental health services. So this includes healthcare-centered substance use disorder treatment in particular. Despite credible research showing that police sweeps and houseless encampments don't solve houselessness and fail to lead to effective housing solutions. I'm gonna say that again. Despite credible research that shows that police sweeps are not as effective as people want you to believe they are. When you come in and you wreck communities, it fails to lead to effective housing. City resources continue to support this harmful practice, this violent practice. My question, and I'm gonna start with you this time, Candace, how will you prevent the displacement of houseless communities and elevate kind of real solutions that result in vulnerable Portlanders finding and maintaining housing? I have a second part to that, but let's just focus this one. How will you prevent displacement for these folks? And I'll give you 2 minutes on the clock.
Yeah. It's a big question. It's the question. But I think there's something in your question that is important, and it's research. Mm-hmm. And I think that's at the core, because ultimately what's happening, or at least what I'm observing, is that we are choosing solutions that are quick fixes, they're Band-Aids, we're brushing it under the rug so that we don't have to see it and we don't have to see the impact of the systems that we have let deteriorate. And then again, that we have a reflexive need to make everything in America punitive, which makes me very frustrated as a leader who sees that impact daily, right? And so I think that, there are lots of ways that we can be preventing this displacement. And I also wanted to bring up, because you're bringing up Street Roots, I am a board member of Street Roots, and have been really proud of the kind of reporting they do. One thing that's important for people to know, and I was talking to my neighbor about this, was that when we are sweeping people and we're taking their belongings, they're having a hard time getting those back. We're sweeping people's birth certificates, their family photos. We're sweeping them away from just like their family heirlooms, things that are precious to them. Imagine if somebody came into your home and saw, your things and just grabbed them all, took them somewhere. You already don't have resources. You already don't have a way to get around, right? And you're just at your lowest, and then they take everything from you. Imagine the toll that is taking collectively on your psyche and on everybody, right? So that's the thing that makes me most upset about sweeps, in addition to all the other things. But how do we expect people to bounce back when we literally take all their possessions and we take away their dignity? That is never going to be a solution that's going to solve homelessness, right? So I could say a lot more. I only have 10 seconds. It's always tough in these kinds of settings because there's just I just want to get into it. But I think the core of the message here is clear that we know that the sweeps are just adding more harm and trauma, and that's the last thing we need.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to, same question, pass it to you, Timur. How will you prevent the displacement of houseless communities and elevate real solutions that result in vulnerable Portlanders finding and maintaining housing? I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and then we'll circle back to the part
Sure.
two.
Yeah. I'm always thinking about big picture with housing. I'm a strong supporter of Portland Neighbors Welcome Inner East Side for All campaign, which seeks to increase density in inner Portland, in areas that have better transportation, great tree canopy, and low displacement risk. What I'm seeing at my kids' school right now is people are moving from inner Portland to outer Portland, and then East Portland has the greatest displacement risk in the city, and then those people are then pushed to Troutdale. And so if we can stabilize inner Portland in terms of kind of that displacement pressure to outer Portland, I think that's going to make a big difference. And then I'm a proponent of social housing, where the government itself builds housing. The market is, dominated by very few actors, which leads to less competition. If you look at who's building houses across the United States, it's a very small number of people. And so I think it's so small that the FTC is kind of suing to stop mergers. And so there is a role for the government of kind of providing its own housing as well. And then I'm someone who's going to be advocating that we don't put all of our eggs in one basket, that we have to have a range of solutions, a range of housing options, that whether it's housing first or shelters, one size isn't going to fit all. And so maybe this doesn't work for you, but permanent housing with supportive services does. It's like, great, let's make that work. And so, and then I've also advocated for a comprehensive review of city-owned land that can be deemed surplus and turned into housing as well. The city is one of the largest landowners in the city. And another thing that we can do is I will be someone who advocates for housing vouchers and union contracts so that the people working and serving the city of Portland have the ability to start a life here and really afford to live in the city that they work. And then ultimately, another thought I have is, when the city does infrastructure projects, it needs to show that that project is for the people who live there. And sometimes that doesn't happen. And the way it can do that is through neighborhood stabilization programs or public art that reflects the culture of that corridor. Trees, which is something East Portlanders continue to say is a high priority, but rarely gets reflected in the infrastructure outcomes that we see. And then project labor agreements so that the people hired to work on that project are reflective of the community.
Get you on time.
And then hiring local and things like that.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I want to get you on time. We have a little bit more time coming up for some open discussion, but I do want to pass it back to Candace to ask a little bit more, part two to that, which is speaking a little bit to the budget. How could public safety service budget funds be allocated? How can we do a better job of allocating the funds that are currently being put towards public safety that could be better used in different ways? We spoke a little bit about this before, that there's somewhat of that there are times where there's some extra money in the police budget that they can't fill. Then at the same time, they're often the ones leading quite a bit of these sweeps. How can we better spend that money? Is it, because we often hear in the folks in our community, they usually get a choice of when they get their stuff removed, they either have to go to jail, fines, or some sort of kind of temporary housing or shelter. But I'm curious, how could this money be better spent?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think high level, we could also talk about the form of government changes, right? Because I think the way that we decide how to spend our money and how we're coordinating between the bureaus is very much dependent on consolidating our services and having real leadership that is that can turn our policy agenda into those outcomes that the bureaus need to deliver on, including the Portland Police Bureau. And so I think that is a big opportunity that we're going to have. I'm hoping that this shift in how we govern will allow us to do have a better understanding of where all our dollars are going, where is there crossover, where can we eliminate some of these inefficiencies and streamline our services. So that's a big part of how we're going to be able to reallocate those budgets or those dollars in those budgets. And I think also, some of the things that Timur is mentioning are important. And I want to say, as it relates to housing, because it's like, okay, inner east side, right? Like, let's increase density. But what does that actually mean? I live in missing middle housing, right? I live in a little townhome community of 30 units, and we keep each other safe. We are always vigilant. We're always like, hey, just making sure, are you okay? Or we're taking care of each other. And I was at like a neighbor, party the other day, and I was thinking more about it. And I was like, this is why those policies work, right? Because if right now, people don't have easier ways to connect. We lack third spaces, as you know. And so we have to consider like what these policy infrastructure decisions actually mean for how we build community, because how we build community affects safety.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Cool, it's very juicy. I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to ask you a very similar question. Thinking about the money that we use for sweeps. Sweeps are they're expensive, and we're doing it a lot and not seeing a lot of change. How can that money be better spent?
The government can affirmatively build the housing. So that can be something that the city does. We could put more money into the housing first model of like housing with supportive services. So ultimately, the money used for sweeps could actually, address the root cause, which is ultimately housing. And, there's been so much talk about things like, You know, are we going to arrest people who, you know, refuse to leave a public park? And it's just like we don't even have the capacity today for everyone who needs and wants housing to get it. And so before we even have that conversation about, you know, are we going to arrest them or not, let's actually focus on increasing that service level capacity so that, you know, people can voluntarily access what they need to get to. That to me is like a basic missing first step. And then another thing we could do is, you know, right now there's a lot of volatility in permitting and housing applications, and because it's based on the market a little bit. And so, you know, the market picks up and then the city is behind in terms of hiring those people. And then the market dips. And then, so it's just like, that's been identified as a kind of a key issue at the city of like, how do we stabilize this important government function of permitting, which you can't build anything without a permit. And so having that be taken care of so it's not so dependent on these kind of more volatile market conditions.
Thank you for that. So I'm hearing you would like to spend this money on some infrastructure, which I heard you're an infrastructure guy. Like this, let's put some money into housing.
Sure.
I do want to come back to this concept you mentioned about we keep us safe, essentially. And I think, which I think something that is kind of missing in some ways is the urban planning component to community safety that you both are speaking towards. Can you share a little bit more about what your vision is, I guess, to stabilize this particular type of community that you just mentioned? This you said this middle housing. What does that look like for you in terms of what you would like to see more resources to allow for folks to build that community cohesion? Yeah.
Let's see. I think that ultimately we all know that we need more housing. That's a universal truth. We all know that. Well, most of us know that. I'm like, hold on, I forgot what room I'm in. Not all of us know this, but most of us know that when you destabilize people, you make it harder for them to get back on their feet, and sweeps destabilize people. And then also, I think we all understand that, you know, as far as keeping each other safe, like that, we're having kind of just a national crisis of loneliness, of disconnection, and we really need to think about how infrastructure helps solve those things, because when you put people closer together, when you put resources near them, you don't create these food deserts, right? When you make sure that kids have sidewalks to get to schools, when you are enhancing all of that infrastructure with programming in collaboration with our partners, and also remembering that there is so much funding we are leaving on the table by not being efficient and asking for those dollars and delivering on those outcomes. And so I think it's our responsibility as the city to be bringing in new revenue in addition to also reallocating our revenue. And I think that there's lots of barriers, as we've been talking about, but ultimately my view as far as what I think we need is just we need leaders that are going to make better decisions about how to allocate those dollars, and that are using that urban planning lens and are able to also bring in people on the ground. Because the other thing that frustrates me, and I'm sure frustrates many of us who work in community-based organizations with our communities, we are not relied on as experts of what we need. And that is a big area that I think the city has failed us, and I'm very eager to change, especially now that we're going to have districts. I think that'll help us build better connections with the CBOs working in East Portland to make sure that we're making these services connect to the infrastructure that we're building, and then all of that tying back up to our community safety. But ultimately, we keep us safe. What that means is if we're going to keep each other safe, we need to have ways to build our community infrastructurally as well as just program-wise.
Thank you for that. For folks listening, we are diving into our third question within the Reimagine Public Safety debate, really talking about houselessness and the displacement that we're seeing with sweeps, and some infrastructure, I think, some alignment here around how we could be spending some money differently to building up the communities that we care about and that are vulnerable. I wanna ask another question, a little bit off book, but relates to the subject before we go to question 4 of you all. It speaks a lot to this thing I mentioned very quickly, that for a lot of folks, they have 3 options when they're getting swept. It's going to jail, it's paying a fine, or it's going to a shelter. And it was a hot topic in terms of our current city council debating, particularly that fine piece. If you remember in the news, there were a few commissioners who are running for mayor who were really big on making sure people are fined for being in poverty, essentially, which is, yeah.
Where's the money going to come from?
Where's the money going to come from, Renee Gonzalez? Where is it going to come from? But I'm asking in this moment because we are also seeing, we're seeing folks particularly die in jail right now. And there is a partnership between the county and the city as it relates to how we do, the joint office of houselessness, like how we actually are looking at this, how we're thinking about folks who are most vulnerable, whether or not moving them into a jail system or finding them is actually a solution to the problem. So I guess I'm curious to know where you both stand on moving folks into these systems, like just to get it on record. Where do you stand on this discussion right now that I think has really been driven by certain folks in media, but also city councilors and other candidates around the best thing we can do right now is just get them off the street, even if that means jailing them, because that's where they're going to get their treatment. A little bit biased there, but yeah, I'm going to pass it to you.
Sure. So as someone who's worked in city government and managed $30 million of streetscape projects, when you work at the city or, you are an elected official, one thing you realize very quickly is that you're not dealing with an unlimited amount of money, is that your financial resources are constrained. And what that means is you have to make decisions on how to strategically address the outcomes you want with the money and resources and staff and budgets that you have. And so, my perspective is, again, if you're sending someone to jail, that has cost, whether it's, the cost of police, the cost to hold them in jail, the cost of the apparatus of the district attorney. And then, the bigger question for me is, did that actually solve the problem? Because then this person is eventually going to come out, and now maybe they have a record, and then now you have to, if you actually want to address this issue, then maybe you have to spend money on expungement so that this person can actually access housing and employment supports, which, again, these issues come up at the gaps and the pinch points of leaving a jail system or leaving incarceration. And so, to me, I'm always like, does this actually solve the problem? And is this the most effective use of city resources? And so that's my commitment as a candidate, is I'm always looking for the best way to solve these issues from a resource perspective. And, generally speaking, that aligns with a lot of the stuff that we talked about here, is that these things are the most cost effective, and sending someone to the carceral system is generally not the most cost effective way to address the issue, and it doesn't address the root cause.
Thank you so much. Just for folks listening, what I heard, just to summarize it, you're not for this concept. It's a waste of money. That's a very basic Joy Davis summary of it. I'm going to pass it to you. Same question. What are your plans on just getting on the record? Do you think this is a good way to move folks, out of the system?
Yeah. Well, I think what is clear to me is that a criminal record is extremely prohibitive for any American to get housing, to get a job, to get their life on track. So if those are the things that we want for humans, then putting them in jail and giving them a record is the exact opposite of what's going to solve the problem. So absolutely I'm against that. I think the other thing that's important to note, there is I was on the governor's task force for downtown. We can share some tea on that later. Lots of opinions about how that all went down. But one thing that I really took away that was important was meeting Morgan Godwin. Are you familiar with them? Yeah. They actually moved from Portland recently, but they are somebody who struggled with addiction for a long time. And long story short, her story was that while she was struggling with addiction, she thought, well, if I go to jail, they'll give me the services. Spoiler alert, they didn't. right? And actually, she found it easier to get drugs in jail, which is a whole other thing. So I think also it's very clear to me that our jails have not been good at delivering on the services, whether it be rehabilitation things or, things related to addiction or many other things. They haven't been good at. So I don't know why we keep turning to that. I mean, I know why we keep turning to that, because we know that jails have been a way to stunt people's growth, their economic growth, their social, political growth in America. And so I am against that concept in general. If we want to give people help, jail is not the place to get help.
Yeah, thank you for folks listening. Some good synergy here. Both candidates we have agree that this is not a real solution. This is a false solution, is what I'm hearing. Before I go to question 4, because we have a little bit of time, I think it connects quite a bit to what's happening at the state level. Particularly, I think folks have used Portland as an example of the recriminalization of minor drug infractions here. And for folks, we'll put some links in our captions, but just looking at some research, what we found in the research is that surprise, surprise, jailing folks is not the best way to get them treatment. We also, a big shout out to our movement building team, really wanted to make sure it was on record who's going to be impacted most by this policy and rolling things back to the war on drugs. And surprise, surprise, Black folks in particular are going to really feel the burden of the fact that now because folks who are I have some choices. I'm going to be careful here, but what we know is that Black folks are going to be impacted most. Houseless folks are going to be impacted most. That if you are poor, you will be judged. And we know that drug use is happening in all forms, across the income bracket, different households, different races. We are all dealing with this in this moment. And it feels like right now, if you're poor, and particularly if you're Black, you're going to be jailed for it. And it seems like I'm hearing that you all don't believe that jail is the best way to get that treatment. I want to go to question 4, but I want to, before I do, see if there's any closing thoughts you have around how we are currently and what your plans may be in the future for how we are dealing with our housing crisis and how that is affecting the houseless community. I'm going to go with you first, Candace, just because I just left you. Is there anything else you want to add or you want folks to know about, some plans that you have that you maybe didn't get a chance to talk about? Yeah.
Plans that I have around addressing homelessness? Is that the general question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we've spoken about the spectrum or the continuum of sheltered housing, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that what bothers me the most too about the conversation of should we jail people who refuse shelter, we have never and still don't have shelter for every person that wants it. There are many people that are dealing with homelessness who want services and they're not getting it. So focusing on some small group of people that might be resistant to the option that you're providing, which by the way, we need way more options for, it just feels like that is not my value. That is not my theory of change. So I think that we need to really assess why do people refuse certain services or shelters or whatever, and figure out what they actually want. It just makes me angry because I'm like, I don't understand why we keep saying we tried nothing and nothing helped and we're going to try nothing again. And, so that's just kind of the spirit that I'm coming with. Of course, there's plenty of policy ideas that I have, and definitely check out my website, CandaceForPortland.com. But I think more so what I want to communicate to your viewers are where my values lie. And I think my values are clear that when people need help, we need to actually provide them that, not systems that have notoriously oppressed our people.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to pass it to you, Timur, for any last minute thoughts on the crisis that we have. Anything else you want to share with viewers?
Sure. I'm always thinking, who is the most appropriate entity to do this work, right? And so we wouldn't ask firefighters to build a sidewalk, right? That belongs with the Bureau of Transportation to build a sidewalk. And so my reason for mentioning that example is, the job of the jail is to hold someone and feed someone and keep them in their custody. They're not great at, these other supportive services that we all desperately seek. And so my vision for that is kind of more like mobile outreach teams that meet people where they are, and kind of almost like a community health model. And whether that's, things like Portland Street Response, or even it's probably more appropriate for the county to do in terms of like they have the more public health space. So I'm always thinking about like who is best equipped to address this issue, and sometimes it is a city branch and sometimes it's not. And so that's just another reason why I think, you know, sending people to jail is not the best option. So
thank you for that.